These plants have been cut from a very resistant cultivar with effective resistance. So the cultivar is pretty much immune to the disease. So there's no symptoms, the pathogen hasn't been able to get into the plant, and we can see here there's no stem canker occurring. The interesting thing with this though is if we look closely, we can see here there's a plant with very, very low levels of infection. And this is the process which we see occurs when resistance is overcome. So we have a totally immune variety of the disease. We'll get very, very low levels of infection. And what's occurring here is within the blackleg population, most of the spores can't attack the plant. But because the population is very diverse, there'll be a very low frequency which it can attack. And in this case, one of those virulent spores has got into this plant and caused a very, very low level of disease. Now that won't cause any yield loss or anything, but what it does do is it means that the virulent blackleg, which got into this individual plant, will now reproduce on this plant over the stubble and produce spores. And then those spores will be released next year, and all of those spores will then be able to attack this resistant cultivar. So what we see is, if you're a farmer who's growing this resistant cultivar, from one year to the next, the frequency of spores which can attack it will increase. And we see in very intensive canola production areas that it takes about 3 years for a crop to go to this, to that, and then to start getting more disease. So it's a bit of an example here. I've picked out a few plants, and when we go and do our blackleg monitoring, this is the process we generally start to see. After a couple of years, this is really the first indicator that the pathogen is starting to overcome our resistance. You just see here, it's just a tiny amount of disease here. Then that's an indicator that the disease has now got into that cultivar. So it's not going to cause the farmer any yield loss, it's not a problem for the industry. However, what it means is that we've now selected one individual of the pathogen which can now attack this resistance. And what will happen is that when this plant dies, because the pathogen is now in the plant, the whole stem will be colonised. And then the fruiting bodies will form and spores will be released from that individual plant, but all the spores from that plant will be able to attack that resistant cultivar. So if a farmer continues to grow this, we'll just see the frequency of those virulent spores increasing. So a couple of years later, this will be the typical level of disease we see in that cultivar which was resistant. So again, it's not causing any yield loss, but we're seeing significant levels of infection, and this will start occurring in most plants. And if we then continue to grow this cultivar, our crop will look like this. And if a farmer's not monitoring for the level of disease in their farm, this will be the first indicator that they see that they've got a problem. So we see the process occurring where you buy your fresh seed, very resistant, it looks like that. 3 or 4 years later, it looks like that. And this is one of the key messages we're trying to get across to growers, that if you're monitoring your crop each year, you can see this process occurring, and 12 months before it looks like this, you'll see those levels of infection, and then you know it's time to switch to a different crop with a different resistance gene complement behind it. If you don't monitor your crop, you won't know until this occurs and your plants start falling over and dying. And that's when we've seen the major yield loss occurs, like we've seen on Eyre Peninsula, for instance. When no one's monitored their crop, we've seen the crops, when they first grew them, they were immune. 3 or 4 years later, the crops have all fallen over and died, and everyone wants to know why. Well, it's a known process. We know how it happens. We know we monitor for it, and we know we can change cultivars before this level of disease occurs.